Okay, now that we've talked about pathogens, let's talk a little bit about an overview of the immune system and how it creates a defense mechanism for our body. So that's what the immune system does. It has a couple ways that it can prevent pathogens from affecting our body, so destroying disease-causing agents. And we're going to look into those now. There's three lines of defenses, ultimately. Think about it like, the way that we can possibly defend a fort. The first line of defense is, that outer wall. And then once you get inside of the fort, there's a couple other things that can happen. So we have the same thing. A first line of defense is literally a physical barrier that would physically present any sort of pathogen, whether that be a bacteria, right, a fungus, a virus, right, some sort of protozoa, some sort of single-celled organism, from getting from the outside world and into our body, into our blood. And so skin, right, is the number one line of defense. We also have oil that is secreted on the surface of our skin and sweat that makes our skin a little acidic, and it's almost like an antibacterial surface that prevents pathogens and bacteria from growing. Within our eyes, ears, nose, any openings that we have into our body, you'll see that we have a mucus membrane. So if you, the inside of our nasal cavity and our respiratory system, we have a mucus membrane. You can think of it kind of like, almost like a fly trap, right? And what that is, it's a sticky substance, as you can see here, right? That would trap any sort of antigens that are floating around in the air. And then the idea is that we use these cilia, or these tiny little hairs, to also trap them, but also we have cilia inside of our trachea that move against the direction of our respiratory tract. So when we cough or when we sneeze, we can then take those pathogens and expel them from our body. Another thing, if it gets into before it gets into our actual blood, is that if we swallow food that has bacteria in it, we're really just dousing it into like this acid bath that would kill a lot of the bacteria on the surface of the food and things like that. But there's also enzymes within our stomach that help destroy any pathogens that get into our stomach. One of those enzymes that we talk about that will destroy and break down bacteria is something by the name of lysozyme. And we find this enzyme throughout many elements of our body and parts of the immune system. We'll find this enzyme within the mucus, within the saliva of our mouth, even within our tears, killing bacteria that lands on our eyes to prevent it from getting into the blood capillaries that surround our eyes. So here's just a picture of that enzyme. Remember, enzymes are nothing but just proteins that break down or that facilitate chemical reactions, and in this case it would be a catabolic chemical reaction breaking down the cell walls of bacteria cells. And so you can see here, this is the polypeptide chain of that enzyme, giving it its shape. So if they do happen to get into your blood, okay, so if they break through the first line of defense and they get into our blood, now we got to go through the second and third lines of defense, and our body has specific mechanisms to do so. And they can send chemical signals that coordinate that specific attack against those pathogens. Some of those things that we can do, the things that control that, there are cells and proteins within our blood in our body that help fight the body's infections. And the most important ones are the white blood cells. And there are many different types. We can abbreviate that as WBC, white blood cells. Some of those white blood cells that fall under a specific category are phagocytic cells, or phagocytes. And the word phagocytosis, remember, means to eat. And so what they do is they engulf any pathogenic cells that are, infected cells, for that matter, that come into our body. Lymphocyte, remember, from the lymphatic system, are these white blood cells that live within our lymphatic system, like T cells and helper T cells and B cells, that also have their own special way of targeting and killing pathogens. But besides cells, we actually have proteins called complement proteins. And what they do is they actually can assemble themselves, right, like here, by poking holes into infected cells that have antigens, causing water to rush in and burst that infected cell or harmful cell. So if this is an infected cell or a harmful cell that has on the surface of its cell membrane an antigen, which is any sort of structure that generates an immune response. And the way that it does that is by having a specific shape that, in this case, binds to these antibodies, a very specific type of antibody, immunoglobulin G, category G. And then it kind of releases this structure that is just a bunch of proteins, right? And then they kind of assemble themselves, almost like a transformer. They assemble themselves into what we call a membrane attacking complex. And then what happens is they just put themselves in the cell membrane, causing it to burst. So it's one way we can kill things. I'm sure you guys have heard of antibodies, right? Antibodies are these kind of Y-like shaped structures. Y-shaped structures that have very specific shapes at the ends of them that are unique to the types of antigens that come into our body. And they're made by things called B cells, which are also referred to as plasma cells, right? And they are a very specific type, right? Very specific type of immune response. And we'll talk a little bit more about what they do later. There's also a chemical that is released from infected cells called interferon. There's a couple different types of interferons. And what we see here is, let's say that this is one of our cells, and it gets infected by a virus. This is the virus right here. Once the virus gets into your cell, we remember what viruses do is they use their DNA. That's the DNA, maybe, or RNA, right? And then it copies the DNA, uses the cell to copy it, and then makes multiple copies of the virus. Once that happens, that triggers this cell to produce the interferon, these chemicals, which are secreted outside of this infected cell. That interferon diffuses around it and will bond to uninfected cells, trying to interfere with that viral infection so that the viruses don't infect neighboring cells. The way that it does that is it triggers the production of these proteins that are antiviral proteins. And they're inactive at first. And what happens is when those viruses that are just produced before get into this new host cell, it has been prepared because of this interferon from these activated antiviral proteins to go in here and then break down and degrade that viral DNA so that it cannot duplicate and create more viruses. So you can see the interferon has triggered this response to make sure that we degrade and break down the messenger RNA, which is the transcripted copy of the DNA from the virus. So it has no instructions to make more virus anymore. There's a couple of different types of immunity that we can gain in this final step of the immune system. We can actually acquire immunity, which means that that we can't get sick from specific pathogens because we have something in our body that helps fight it. We can get what's called passive immunity. A passive immunity occurs when you yourself are not going through the responses, when you yourself are not producing the antibodies, when you yourself are not actually getting sick and then generating these things, that you're just kind of piggybacking or borrowing it from somebody else who actually did go through those processes. An example would be the milk, right, of the mothers of mammals. Inside of that milk are antibodies, right, that the mother produced from getting infected throughout her life. And then so they give that to the child, and the child is protected from anything that would be destroyed from those antibodies without having to generate them themselves. Another way is we can actually literally take a serum, right? We just take portions of the blood that has antibodies in them, and we can inject it into individuals, making them immune. This is called passive immunity. Active immunity, right, would be like getting sick. An active immunity means that you yourself are now preparing yourself from not getting sick again.